Thank you all very much. Thank you for inviting me today. I have to say I'm a little bit nervous because, anytime there's a professor at Tufts that you all know, I think Saul Gettleman, who says, if you ever get up to give a lecture or a speech and you're not a little nervous, then you know it's time to kind of hang up your lecturing trope because you don't have it anymore. So I'm actually glad that I'm a little bit nervous. What I want to talk to you about today is the relationship between history and international relations. It's a relationship that can be a little bit complex, and it's a relationship that's not always been a terribly peaceful one could say. Historians have always been part of the evolution of the field of international relations. When the field first began to develop in the 20th century, diplomatic historians in Great Britain were on the cutting edge of developing various aspects of IR theory and of the very foundations of the beginnings of international relations as an accepted academic field itself. Over the decades, however, especially in the United States, the role of history in IR has ebbed and flowed. At the American Historical Association conference in 1978, the then president of the AHA gave a lecture, a discussion on the role of history in IR. And talked about the need to try to find some ways to reinfuse the study of international relations with a broader appreciation, or at least a broader access to the field of history. Now, all of you as scholars of international relations know that IR is a field that is full of different theoretical approaches. Just to list a small number of them, there's realism and neorealism and liberalism and neoliberalism and post-liberalism and constructivism and feminism and the English school and functionalism, and the list goes on and on and on and on. All of these theoretical approaches have a variety of different values. All of them, in essence, provide different insights into key issues. What I want to argue today is that history as a discipline can as actively contribute to a broader understanding of international relations as can the theoretical approaches. And in fact, that in many ways, history and the theory can actually work together and can actively complement each other. Now, from the historical standpoint, certainly, you can argue that history provides context, it reveals complexity, and it can even at times provide avenues for the challenging of various theoretical approaches in IR. But that's not the track I want to take today. Rather, I want to look at how international relations theory can actually infuse, enforce, and further the study of history itself. How some of the theories in IR can actually make us as historians think in a more complex and a more careful way, and even in a way challenge some of our own assumptions about historical paths that we feel are overly well-tread, and maybe there's nothing more to talk about, when in reality there's a lot more to talk about. I came to international relations very, very late. I'm a triple jumbo. I've been here for 25 years. I didn't really start to understand what international relations was, quite honestly, until about 2011. As an undergraduate here, it was the beginning of the IR program. It was still very much in its growing phase. It was not the largest major at Tufts yet. In fact, it wasn't really even close to the largest major at Tufts yet. History, English, economics, biology, all those had a significantly larger following. But IR was growing, and as you all know, it's grown to be one of the marquee majors at Tufts. My first exposure to IR was being dropped right in the middle of it. In 2011, one of my colleagues in history, Howard Malco, who was supposed to teach a brand new course on international relations and its relation to history, suddenly had to take a leave of absence. There was no one to teach the course, so naturally, as the more junior member of the department, they simply told me that that was going to be my privilege to teach it. My knowledge of IR theory could have filled a thimble, and that's maybe being kind to myself. I was not all that familiar with anything outside of perhaps realism and liberalism. Constructivism, functionalism, the role of feminism in IR theory, post-colonial IR theory, none of this was anything I had any real concept of. So during that spring semester, there was a steep learning curve. And the poor students who suffered through that class with me, in essence, we really did learn together. As much as I was talking to them about the connection between some of the theories and the history, they were in essence helping me to get a better grasp of the theoretical approaches. What I began to understand, though, as I gave lecture after lecture, trying to find some way to connect these two aspects, to really see where the interaction between IR theory and history could be, I began to re-examine some of the topics that I had covered by that time, for over a decade. Topics like the French government under the leadership of Cardinal Richelieu, or Byzantium. And everybody who knows me knows I can't ever give any kind of a talk without mentioning the Byzantines, because they're fundamental, or at least I think they are. And I'll talk a little bit more about them a little bit later on. As I was teaching this course, I began to really gain a better sense of what international relations was as a discipline, a better sense of the different theoretical approaches. But I also realized I was beginning to reevaluate my own take on some of the history that I was teaching. And I think one of the most stark realizations came when we were talking about Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu, 17th century France. Cardinal Richelieu, someone who is in essence usually skipped over or not given much fanfare in the narrative of 17th century French history, because after Richelieu comes Louis XIV, the Sun King, the Grand Monarch, the man who said, "I am the state," the paragon in a way of notions of absolute divine right monarchy. Many historians simply argue, well, it was the Richelieu, Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of Louis' predecessor, Louis XIII, who laid the foundations for all of this. Laid the foundations so that Louis XIV could then claim to be this divine right monarch. But that, as I looked into it more and more, to me, was clearly not the case. In fact, in a very real sense, Cardinal Richelieu was practicing ideas of realpolitik 200 years before Bismarck. And in many ways, what Richelieu was doing was acting in a way that was prioritizing the centralization and the strengthening of the French state. Even using the term state for some historians to discuss France before 1648 is grossly inappropriate. The notion of the modern state, by some definitions, doesn't exist until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. But I was looking at what Richelieu sought to do and trying to understand what his goals were. It struck me that his goals were focusing on the needs, the requirements of the state. And at the very core, his main interest was the state. Everything else was secondary, or in a sense, almost completely unimportant. I think an interesting example of that is the policies that Richelieu will take towards French Protestants. Now, by the 17th century, French Protestants had been granted full, or almost full, a full level of legal and political equality in France. Not completely, but almost. They were considered more or less on equal footing with French Catholics, unique for the time because no other state in Europe gave equal footing to Protestants and Catholics. Richelieu, as chief minister for the French king Louis XIII, went to war with the Protestants and stripped them of a host of their rights. But the rights he stripped them of were not their religious rights, not their rights to religious liberty, not their rights to freedoms, not their rights to serve as equal members to a degree in French society. What he stripped them of were their extra rights, their extra political rights that they had been granted in decades past. Those rights that he stripped them of included the right to maintain fortified towns, the right to maintain their own courts, the right to maintain standing armies, and so forth. Why does Richelieu do this? Again, the standard historical trope is that he's simply trying to build up the power of the monarchy, that he's increasing the control of the king, Louis XIII, and in a sense, he's working to improve the power of that particular king. What one might argue, however, is that in reality, what he's really working to do is to build up institutions. The institutions that will effectively support, guide, and secure the state. And for Richelieu, the monarchy is not about a man. The monarchy is, in fact, an institution, and fully an institution. Whomever sits upon the royal throne is more or less totally unimportant. It's the institution of the monarchy that is critical. And what Richelieu seeks to do in France is ensure that that institution of the monarchy is the center of all significant forms of power. Control over the court systems, control over the military, that in essence power rests in the hand of that institution. So that whomever thus controls that institution has then a method to control France. Now that, in my mind, reality is somewhat lost after Richelieu, when we get to the time of Louis XIV, when France becomes, and French history becomes in many ways about Louis himself, about his concept of the king as the state, the person of the king as the state. Not the institution of the monarchy, but the person of the king as the state. And that is not at all what Richelieu intended. What Richelieu intended, in essence, was to begin to craft a monarchical structure that could survive subpower monarchs, that did not in any way really rest in the hands of one individual or one series of individuals. What he sought to create was the institutions of the state. And in some ways, he was successful at doing so. What Louis XIV will build on and manipulate are the institutions that Richelieu, in essence, leaves behind. And once Louis XIV is gone, what's left behind is not so much Louis's personal legacy, although that's certainly there, but perhaps more pronounced are some of those institutional developments that Richelieu had set in motion. And I use this as just an example of how, for me, looking at, again, history that I had taught for well over a decade and had learned about for much longer, how my interpretation of that history was dramatically changed, and how I began to gain a new appreciation, perhaps a new willingness to question some of my own preconceived ideas and preconceived notions. Another example I want to point out is Alexander the Great. Last spring, I taught a course on Alexander the Great, a new course which was effectively, again, an attempt to understand what Alexander was seeking to do, the challenges he faced, and what perhaps his legacy was. As we dove into the course, part of the challenge was understanding the political ideology that Alexander the Great followed. Was he influenced by the notions of Athenian democracy? Was he influenced by the very unique structure of the Macedonian kingdom, the governance of which he had inherited from his father, a kingdom in which loyalty was very heavily based on the person of the king, not the institution of the monarchy? Or was he more inspired and influenced by the type of government that he will effectively gain control of in Persia? A very radial sense of power, where the Persian king is, in a sense, at the core, but the further you get from the actual capital of the Persian Empire, the weaker royal control actually in many ways becomes. Was Alexander, when he conquers Persia, when he builds up an empire that is larger than anything that had really ever been seen before, what kind of political organization does he focus on? And again, the writings on Alexander the Great by historians tend to fall into a variety of camps. Either he simply tries to transport the Macedonian model onto this broader empire, number one. Secondly, that he simply adopts the more radial focus that was a caricature of Persian power structures. Third, and perhaps the most difficult to really fully prove, is that his strongest influence comes from his connections to the scholars of Athens and to notions of how the Athenian government was structured. As we went through the course, what we began to think about and began to talk about is that maybe it was none of those three things. Maybe what Alexander the Great sought to do was find some kind of a fusion of all of them. A fusion that would bring to the Persian Empire the beginnings. He never achieved it, but the beginnings of a different kind of political cohesion. A political cohesion that was focused around increasing centralized institutions like a centralized army. A cohesion that was focused around the individual person of Alexander himself. And a cohesion that would be focused around providing a broader level of voice, or at least some level of participation on the surface, if not in reality, for the various parts of the empire. That for us then begged the question as well, about how we should look at the role of the individual. How does the individual connect to the institution? What role does an individual play within an institution? Do institutions trump the individual, or can the individuals at points trump the institution? And certainly in historiography, the notion of the great man or great woman in history is an old tried and true formula that was largely pushed aside in the 50s and 60s, but an ideology that made something of a comeback in the 90s and more recently, but in a much more complex way. And I think with the example of Alexander, what we can see to a degree is that by using some aspects of international relations theoretical approaches, we can begin to see a little bit more complexity, not only what Alexander sought to achieve, but perhaps equally as important, in what the role of the individual can be defined as in these great historical stories. That then leads perhaps to new ways to think about a Napoleon, a Hitler, a Stalin, a Mussolini, or even maybe a Vladimir Putin today in some ways. My last example will be, as no one will find surprising, the Byzantine Empire. Byzantium lasted for 1,118 years. It spanned a large part of the eastern Mediterranean, and at its height included the Middle East, North Africa, Italy, the Dalmatian coast, and all of southeastern Europe. It was a massive empire, and a very complex empire. And again, when historians, especially non-Byzantine historians, Western European historians in particular, look at Byzantium, they effectively see it as some kind of a throwback, some kind of a political oddity. An empire that is deeply Christian, and all attempts in most cases to discredit the notion that Byzantium had in its very fabric the ideals of Christianity have more or less been effectively vanquished. You can't talk about Byzantium without talking about Christianity. That one fact has often been used then to simply dismiss the whole study of the political structures of Byzantium, because they're so linked to the Christian faith, linked to the idea that this emperor is Christ's divine representative, or Christ's representative on earth, that those political structures can't possibly have any bearing in a more modern society. But what's often forgotten is the complexity of what Byzantium actually represented. And again, when you think about Byzantium in terms of power structures, in terms of methods of centralization, in terms of political organization and cohesion, a somewhat different picture begins to emerge. We find in Byzantium, for example, a tightly controlled economy. An economy where virtually all major decisions are made by the central government in Constantinople, almost without exception. And trade in Constantinople that is itself even more rigidly controlled by the imperial government. We find the Byzantines developing actually a vast network of what in more modern parlance we might term diplomats. Individuals who don't simply go on embassies to various capitals to represent the position of the emperor, but individuals who are permanently stationed in the capitals of key rivals or at times key allies of the Byzantines. In essence, what Byzantium had begun to develop in a sense was for them what proved to be realistically a network of spies, but in a broader sense was a network of diplomatic connection, an attempt to make sure that the Byzantine voice could be heard in Italy, that the Byzantine voice could be heard in the capital of the Persian Empire, and could be heard not just every so often, but heard on a more regular basis. When we think about the impact of Byzantium, we think about the structures that Byzantium in essence created, we have to also think about the peoples who were thus inspired by and influenced by the Byzantines. Byzantium certainly has a broad influence on southeastern Europe, Serbia, Bulgaria, Kiev, and eventually the Dukes of Moscow. All are in many ways influenced by the political ideology, the religious ideology certainly, and the economic ideology of Byzantium, which makes the inheritance the ideological inheritance, the religious inheritance, the political inheritance of parts of Southeastern and Eastern Europe dramatically different than the inheritance in Western Europe, which I think thus leads to additional questions. Again, as we try to think about what the model of a state is, it's important, I think, to think about the complexities in crafting that model. And part of the complexities is, in a way, understanding the historical forces that help shape specific models. That what is defined as a state in Western Europe is in no way, in many cases, some would argue, others would strongly disagree, but some would argue is in no way necessarily fully comparable to a state in Southeastern Europe. Yes, the models look similar. The overlay looks similar. But when you poke a little bit beneath the surface, when you look a little deeper underneath, there are strong differences. What have caused those differences, where do those differences originate or come from? Those differences, some argue, can come perhaps from a different historical inheritance, from a different historical memory. And I think in a way, what my exposure to international relations theory, and more broadly simply to the field of international relations studies, has done for me is open my mind to the complexities of, again, the history that I've studied for so long. To see these complexities and to try to understand these complexities in a new and perhaps more informed way. At the same time, I think that the historian can provide some different kind of access for the international relations scholar. And the two are not inherently, obviously, mutually exclusive. What history can provide is context, is complexity, and history can augment the idea that one size does not in any way fit all. In some senses, one of the enduring aspects of post-colonial theory is that specific argument, that there is not one model that necessarily fits all. That yes, the overarching structures at points might be the same, thanks in part to aspects of European imperialism. But underneath those structures is something totally different. And that's not just potentially true in places that were part of a Western European conquest, but it's perhaps equally true in places like Southeastern Europe, where there is a very different historical legacy, there's a very different political inheritance, there's a very different sense of what even defines power. And as we try to understand the world we live in today, part of that challenge, I think, is understanding those complexities and trying to look below easy answers, look below simple models, and understand that there's perhaps more there. And again, certainly there'd be a lot of people who would disagree with me on this. But for me personally as a scholar, this is what has continually motivated me, to try to figure out what those complexities are, but also to work to understand, again, that there are dramatic differences, even within what we see maybe as one kind of unified or quasi-unified shared inheritance. As a scholar of Southeastern Europe, it is consistently, my frustration perhaps, and then my challenge to inform people that the Balkans are not like France or Britain or Germany or Spain. They're historically dramatically different. And when the Balkan Wars erupted in the 1990s, understanding what motivated those wars went beyond simply understanding the immediate provocations, the immediate economic and territorial provocations, that there was a broad historical legacy that needed to be better understood and better incorporated into any response and any attempt to gain some level of stability in that region. And I think more broadly, that's a lesson that I feel is valuable in a host of different situations, in a host of different contexts. I'll end with just a few closing comments on something that is actually perhaps, is very modern and just happened. I was watching the news last night, and there was a story on President Obama giving a speech at a prayer breakfast a day or so ago, in which he in some way compared, and again, the way the media portrayed it, if you listen to what the president actually said, it's not quite the way the talking heads necessarily portrayed it. But the president effectively compared ISIS to the Crusades and to the Spanish Inquisition, saying in a sense, not comparing them directly, but saying in a sense that these are all examples of excesses done in the name of faith. That they're all examples of brutality done in the name of faith. That's an interesting comment to make. It's an interesting comment to make. And as a kind of a, in a speech as kind of a cast-off comparison, maybe it's not anything that should really worry us. On the other hand, though, that statement, and I'm not, you watch the responses to it, the kind of knee-jerk far-right reaction, which says that the president is somehow now actively criticizing Christianity, or the far-left reaction, which is invariably just saying that, he was being misunderstood or something like that. None of those commentaries or none of those reactions are actually all that helpful. The reality is that that statement, again, was meant to be nothing more probably than just kind of a base comparison. But those kinds of statements are incredibly problematic because at the heart, that statement is utterly false and shows a complete lack, in a way, of understanding of the historical complexities of something like the Crusade or like the Spanish Inquisition. And that's not inherently, by any means, the president's fault. He was simply making a broad, general comparison. But at the same time, for us as scholars, us as global citizens, and for you all as the future generation of leaders, not only for the United States, but on the world stage, it's important to remember that those kinds of statements are incredibly dangerous in many ways and incredibly problematic. That you cannot simply actively compare three things, say they're exactly the same, without making sure you fully understand the historical realities of each piece of it. And to say that the Spanish Inquisition was terror, was brutality done in the name of faith, is just historically inaccurate. It's just not right. Even during the period of the Inquisition, it was very well known that the Inquisition in Spain had little or nothing to do with Christianity. In many ways, it was about the advancement of the power of the Spanish monarchy. Christianity was there, but even the papacy in Rome was painfully aware that this Inquisition in Spain was not exactly doing what the Inquisition was, in theory, supposed to do. That it was being used as a tool not necessarily to root out those who somehow had broken away from Christianity, but was being used as a tool to root out political dissenters, to root out anyone who challenged the authority of the Spanish crown. To say that the Crusades are all cloaked in religion, in the fight of Christianity versus Islam, again, is simply untrue and is at very basic level just simplistic. It's just not reality. And first of all, there was no one single crusade. There were a multitude of crusades. And all these crusades had different causes, had different goals, and in many ways had very different results. It wasn't always about necessarily a conflict between Christianity and Islam per se. Sometimes it was between Christianity and Christianity. Sometimes the religious aspects were almost non-existent. It wasn't about faith. And even at the time, people knew they weren't necessarily fighting for Christ. They were fighting for economic advantage. They were fighting to gain a political or a military foothold. They were fighting for power. Yes, it might have been cloaked in ideas of religion, but even the people of the time knew that that cloak was simply a false covering. They knew the reality. And when you read the sources, you can come to understand this. So I think, for my part, or from my perspective, one of the most important things that we can all do as scholars, and that you can all do as the future, is to make sure that when you think about any issue, that you seek to understand what the complexities are, that you seek to understand not just what a theoretical approach will tell you might happen, or seek to explain why something did happen, but try also to understand the historical complexities, which might make you challenge that theoretical approach, might make you argue that actually the realist approach doesn't fully answer the question of why World War II took place. Maybe realism is only part of the answer. Maybe the other part is some combination of liberalism and constructivism. Maybe together they provide the answer. In a way, I think we've become far too willing and made it far too easy to look at the past and try to argue, first of all, that the past can only vaguely inform the present, or, on the flip side, to argue that, well, this event now is exactly like this event 500 years ago. And again, what that fails to do is to understand the nuances and the complexities. And every time we do that, every time we make that mistake, and it is a mistake, every time we make that mistake, what we do is precipitate further misunderstanding. When we fail to understand what history is really trying to tell us, when we fail to understand and to really look into the complexities of historical events and simply use them as some kind of a political trope, all we do is precipitate and propagate further misunderstanding. And that's certainly something in our world that we have more than enough of. What we need to do instead is to appreciate the impact of history, not try to acknowledge or not pretend that history is going to repeat itself necessarily, but understand that the past does fundamentally matter. And to understand why actions take place today, we must understand the past to the best of our ability. But we must understand it in a way that actually seeks to look at the past through its own lens. We must try to understand not what a 20th century interpretation might be, but we must go back and read what the men or women at the time were actually saying, what they actually believed they were doing. Not what we casually want to think they were or what's convenient for us when we put together comparisons. So at the end, I think it's a responsibility of every scholar, every student, every citizen, in a way, to ensure that we appreciate the lessons of history, but moreover that we appreciate always the complexity and the depth of history. And I think for all of you as scholars of international relations, it's important for you as much as important as it is to understand the various theoretical approaches. What will help you make those theories more effective, make them more useful tools, is to really understand the history that provides the complexity and the context for them. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Professor Proctor. That was a really, really informative talk. So now, before we turn you loose on the bounty of Dave's fresh pasta that we have downstairs, we're going to have our two panel leaders introduce the panels that they are going to be running immediately after lunch. So first, Val is going to introduce the research and policy panel.
Hi everybody, my name is Valerie. I'm a senior, and I'm going to be moderating the Government Policy and Research panel, and that's going to be happening after lunch at 1:30 in this room. And I'd like to introduce some of the people on the panel. I hope everybody's here. So we've got Lisa, who's class of 2014, raise your hand. And she's a research assistant at ABT Associates, a research and consulting company. We have Ariana. All right, she'll be coming. Oh, there she is. She's there. Great. She's an instructional coach and coordinator at the learning community. We have Pedro. Not here yet. Okay, he's a research intern at the Beacon Hill Institute. We have David Myers. There we go. Who's a research analyst at the Harvard School of Public Health. We have Ben Wang. He'll be coming. He's a researcher at the Eurasia Group. And then we have Amber. And Amber is a Peace Corps volunteer recruiter. And then we have Ambassador Mary Beth Leonard, who will be joining us for the panel at 1:30. Okay.
Hi, everybody. My name is Greg. I'm a junior. I'll be moderating the Corporate Business Development, All Finance-Related Subjects panel. Very excited. First, we have, that'll be happening in Cabot 205, by the way. First, we have Mira Leon, who is a consulting analyst at Fidelity. She's on her way. We have Katie Monson, who is an analyst with Vantage Partners. She's over there. We have Mark Eisenberg, who's a senior associate at Radius, who's a tech company. Awesome. We have Nishant, who is a business coordinator at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. Oh, excellent. Hi. We have Nick, who is a consulting analyst at Fidelity Investments. Very dapper in his suit. And finally, we have David Kellogg, who is a consultant at Ernst & Young. Awesome. So the panels will begin at 1:30, and please enjoy your lunch. The vegetable sandwiches are so heavy.
Yeah.
They're so heavy. I don't know why they're that heavy, but they're so heavy. Vegetable sandwiches.
Oh my god. Yeah. There's also. That's true. I don't know.